Hello, Accelerated Math 7-8 students. We are beginning Module 10, Lesson 6, and that is called Fluency with Percents, and that can be found on page 55 in my comp book. Sorry for the bell. Fluency with percents. So basically, you guys have been doing a ton of work with percents. I've showed you many different ways, many different formulas, many different models. And so today is just going to be, let's practice what we've been working on, practice what we've been learning. And so our goal for today is, today we will practice all of the different strategies with percents that we've been learning. The question that I want you to think about during this practice time is, what is the most important thing to do when working with percents? I have just been asking and asking and asking you to do this with every problem. Some of you have gone, oh, I don't want to, but when you do, it makes the whole problem more comprehensible. So please remember what it is that you have to do when you're working with percents. I'll give you a big giant hint. It starts with an L, and it ends with an L, the parts. Think about that. Okay, so practice this. This is fun. I am talking about Mrs. Samora and myself because we know that you have her. Some of you. Some of you have Miss Jenkins. So if you want to put Miss Jenkins where it says Miss Samora, you can. Okay. Miss Samora has 25 more students than Mrs. Nelson in her 7th grade classes. The total number of 7th graders in both teachers' classes is 125. What percent is Mrs. Nelson's class? What percent is Mrs. Samora's? Okay. So we have some information going on in here. And it says, read it again, looking for quantities this time. Miss Samora has 25 more students than Mrs. Nelson in her 7th grade classes. The total number of 7th graders in both teachers' classes is 125. What percent is Mrs. Nelson's class? What percent is Miss Samora's class? So we're actually having to use several different techniques to get through this problem, and hopefully you remember them all because I'm basically just building on knowledge that I've given you. First thing that I would like you to do, because I'm really trying to get you to do this, hint, hint, this is your question, identify the parts in the story, okay? So we have kind of a long list. Look at all of the parts we have to identify this time. So we're going to identify what would represent Mrs. Nelson, okay? We are going to then represent what would be Miss Samora, okay? Then we would represent the total. Okay, then we need to identify which of those would be the quantity, which of those would be the percent, and which of those would be the whole. Okay, so we've got two different things going on here. All right, so first thing we need to go back. Miss Samora has 25 more students than Mrs. Nelson in her 7th grade classes. Do we know how many Miss Samora has? No, we don't. Do we know how many Mrs. Nelson has? No, we don't. But what do we know more information about Mrs. Samora than we do Mrs. Nelson? Miss Samora has 25 more than Mrs. Nelson. So we're comparing Mrs. Samora's amounts to Mrs. Nelson's. So we could say that Mrs. Nelson has X students, right? We know that Miss Samora has 25 more than Mrs. Nelson. So we take Mrs. Nelson and we add 25 to her, and that would represent Mrs. Samora. Okay? Do we know the total number of 7th graders in both teachers' classes? Yes, that is 125. Okay, so that's okay. Now we have to take those three pieces and we have to fill in what we know about percents. Do we have a quantity? Yes, it depends on the problem. In the first problem, if we're trying to find the percent of Mrs. Nelson's class, then we would have to do Nelson's class equals a percent times the whole, right? And if we were doing Samora's class, we would have to do Samora's class equals percent times whole. Okay, so we have those two as the quantity being N, quantity being S. The percents, obviously, we don't know them. Those are the percents, okay? The whole, we do know. What is the whole? The whole never changes. The whole is the same for both scenarios. The whole is always 125 kids, okay? So do you see how we were able to identify the parts? Good. All right, so then the next step says make a modified double number line. Okay, so we're going to do this. Here's 0, right? And then we know what our total is, so we know what represents 100%. So I'm going to say 100% is over here. All right, so now before I go any further, I need to figure out what this looks like. Okay, so we know that we have Mrs. Nelson's class plus Mrs. Smora's class all equals 125. Now, why am I doing this? I'm trying to figure out what percentage of the total would be Miss Nelson. And so what I need to do, because this total represents my kids and Miss Zamora's kids, so we need to figure out what my quantity is before we can determine the percent. So we have to combine this to figure out what X is. Okay, so let's try that. So now I see I have to combine like terms, so put a heart here and a heart here and a circle here. So combining the like terms, I now have 2 X's plus 25, which I cannot combine because it doesn't have an X, and all of that equals 125. Well, now I can use my BU chart to help me. So I have X. The first thing I did to X is I multiplied it by 2. The second thing I did to X is I added 25. So now to undo that, I need to subtract the 25, divide by the 2, and I should be left with X. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 25 from both sides. When I do that, that becomes a 0 pair. What I'm left on the left of the equation is 2X equals 100. Divide both sides by 2, and I get X equals 50. Okay, so that means that there are 50 students in my class, X. X, go back up here, X was Mrs. Nelson. So now we know that Mrs. Nelson equals 50 students. Miss Zamora equals 75 students. Aha! So that was really helpful. So now our quantity on this one is going to be 50. If we're doing Miss Zamora's, it's going to be 75. Boys and girls, do you understand why we did that? Okay, I hope so. All right, so now we know that the quantity is 50. We know that the total is 125. So I'm thinking if I'm listening to myself, why don't I draw a tape that is split into 5 sections? Why did I do that? Because I know that the total is 125. So what could go in each section? Well, we know this would be 0 over here. We know that this would be 25, 50, 75, 100, and 125. Okay? So now I know what each section represents, and for Mrs. Nelson, let's do it like this so we can use all the same picture at the same time. We're going to say this is Nelson. We're going to say this is Samora. We're getting very creative. So it says that Mrs. Nelson has 50 students, so she needs to color in this much. So we extend these lines up to our modified double number line, and we have this, and now we have to figure out what would be the percentage at 50 students. Well, I know that the percentage at 125 is 100%. So the question is, how did I get from 125 to 50? Well, that's pretty simple. You're going to take 125 and you're going to divide it by 50. Okay, so can 50 go into 1 evenly? No. Can 50 go into 2 evenly? No. Can 50 go into 125 evenly? Well, so if you need help with it, draw it out. There's 4 quarters in $1, right? And then there's another quarter here. So let's see how many 50s go in there. There's 1, and there's 2. Okay, so I'm going to put a 2 up here. 50 times 2 is 100, and I'm left over with 25, right? So then I put a decimal point, and I bring this down. So now, how many 50s are in $2? So there's $1, $2, and 50 cents. Circle the 50s. 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 50s go in there. So that gives me 250. So it says 2.5 is how I got from there. So I have to now take 100% and divide it by, right, 2.5. Okay, so then I need to do this and do this. So 25 goes into 100 4 times. So that gives me that, 40. So guess what? This is 40%. Okay? Does everybody see how I did that? So that would be 40%. Let's double check it with the equation and see if it works. So I have 50 equals what percent of 125? Okay, so if I'm doing that, the U chart, my variable is going to be the percent sign. Okay, first thing I did was I multiplied it by 125. So to undo that, I divide it by 125 and I should get my percent. Well, let's see. So I'm going to divide by 125 on this side. What you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So we're going to take 50 and we're going to divide it by 125. Let's see what we get. So 125 cannot go into 5 evenly, cannot go into 50 evenly, but can go into 500 evenly. So we're going to say $1.25 goes into $5. Let's see, 125. Let's try 4. That's 20, 8, 9, 10. Regroup, and that's 5. Okay, so that goes 4 times. Pretty simple. Left with a 0. Then I have to take that and multiply it by 100 so that I get the percent, and I get 40%. So it did work. Okay? So hopefully you can understand either way. We did the modified double number line way, or we did the formula way, and we came up with the exact same answer. So we know that my class, right, it said, if you're answering the question, what percent is Mrs. Nelson's class? We know that my class was 40%. Now, if we go back here and we finish coloring what we represented, this chunk is Mrs. Nelson's class of the total. So then when you're coloring it in, this chunk would have to be Mrs. Samora's class, and we know that up to here is 40%. So what plus 40 gives you 100? 60%. So Mrs. Samora's would have to be 60%. So Mrs. Nelson's equals 40%. Miss Samora's equals 60% of the kids. Okay? How do we feel about that? A lot of combined work, but as long as you talk it out what you're doing, if you label your parts, if you pay attention to all of the different things that we have put together, these kind of problems really are very easy. The key is identifying your parts, remembering how to combine like terms, remembering all the different steps and the pictures that represent what's going on in our brain, and then working from there. Okay? So, again, our goal for today was, today we will practice all of the different strategies with percents. There's a lot, as you could see just on that one paper. What is the most important thing to do when working with percents? The answer, kiddos, is label, 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 label. Label your parts first and then organize yourself. Okay? And that's what we're going to be doing tomorrow, is just practicing more problems like this. All right. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.